to know her, and we did our first Dead Poets Society. And she read this poem that we were all just blown away by, and I asked her, so who was the author? I'd never heard that poem before. And she was, oh, I wrote it. And Gracie has a lot of thoughtful emotions, and she really understands who she is, and she feels really deeply and sees other people. I'm going to read you this short thing that we produced in Muse Therapy. That is from her diary that she wrote in 10th grade. I'll never be enough, I'll never be the same. I can try to climb the limestone wall of stolen thoughts of we don't need her. Why tear the papers and why rise when you're a poser? So her ability to really understand that people are going through things is pretty profound. So I'm excited for you to hear her thesis today, which is titled Prozac, Baker Acts, and the Attack on Normalcy, a root cause analysis of America's mental health epidemic. And if you'll come up, I'll pray for you. I should have practiced earlier because I'm gonna cry. All right. Lord, I thank you so for Gracie and how you have made her intelligent and beautiful and thoughtful. And I just thank you for all the work that she has done on this thesis and the personal aspect of it, the story that she wants to tell, and the hope that she wants to offer people, and ultimately, Lord, her faith in you. I pray that you will just give her peace and calmness as she presents today, and just help her to feel confident and joy as she stands before this audience giving them her thesis. I ask all these things in your name. Amen.
Half of us are sick. Statistically, one of the students on your left or right has or is struggling with a mental health problem. For the adults in the room, it is 1 in 5 of you. To begin my thesis, I would like to share a story of how easy it is to get sucked into the vortex of the United States mental health epidemic. Like every other teenage girl who has come before me, I was struggling socially and clashing with my parents a bit during my junior year of high school. However, this caused me to hit a bout of depression. I was burned out and my grades started dropping. Eventually, the depression got in the way of my usual routine, so my parents took me to see a doctor who simply prescribed me a common antidepressant to assist with the emotional symptoms I was having. However, after a few weeks, it felt like a switch had flipped in my brain. I developed an unusual amount of energy. I started losing myself in huge, unfeasible artistic projects and denied my basic needs to work on them. I stopped eating and I stopped sleeping, and it felt like my whole personality had changed. When describing this to my doctor during my very extensive 15-minute telehealth appointments, they ended up switching my medications 3 times in 1 month. And eventually I found myself on 3 medications for something that was a very simple problem to begin with. After that, everything got worse, and I started growing really out of touch with reality. 3 months before, without any medications, I was experiencing what some people might have called normal adolescent problems. But here I was, so ill that the line was blurring between the real world and the world within my mind. I wish I could say that my experience with psychotropic medications was some weird fluke in the system, but the amount of people in the United States who are overprescribed or misprescribed makes my issue just a drop in the bucket. Today, 1 in 6 Americans take at least 1 psychiatric medication. These drugs for treating mental illness are supposed to be at their most effective and advanced, so why then is the number of people with disabling mental illness snowballing? And if these medications were doing more harm than good, why are there not more restrictions surrounding their usage, promotion, and marketing? This is only the beginning of America's most covert epidemic. Every time society undergoes major shifts in everyday life, there is a substantial rise Today, in the fourth industrial revolution, we live amidst a brave new world of boundless choices, unlimited knowledge, and technology that just keeps getting better and better. The mental illness epidemic now disables 850 people every single day. 850 people become so sick to the point that they are diagnosed with illnesses so severe that they qualify for checks from the government. To understand how mental illness went from being a social taboo to affecting half the youth in our nation, we must observe the context of our time, our social outlook on mental illness, and the ancestry of our current remedies. Treatment of the mentally ill in Western culture has been a long, complicated, and brutal history. The foundation of much of today's modern psychiatry and Western philosophy on mental illness was born out of Enlightenment theory, the teachings of Sigmund Freud, and religious doctrine. In the 19th century, the main form of mental health care was Quaker-run asylums that emphasized Christian treatment and had excellent discharge results, but physical treatment gradually overtook religious asylums to care for the new influx of patients. Our problem started in the 1930s and 40s, characterized by hostile guesswork of miracle treatments for mental illness, most notably the frontal lobotomy, in which a patient or a doctor would sever a patient's nerve pathways from other regions of the brain. These treatments were not designed for the masses, so Czech chemist and inventor of penicillin Frank Berger created the first minor tranquilizer called Miltown for the general public. This pill was a catalyst for modern psychiatry. Miltown grew so popular that a television program called The March of Medicine began to display all the new wonder drugs to the American public, the beginning of the pharmaceutical marketing on television. Since then, we have opened a Pandora's box. Like an invasive species, pharmaceuticals upstage all other forms of treatment. They eclipse therapy, they trump institutionalization. These drugs hold so much power that in the Oval Office, President Kennedy enacted the Community Mental Health Act in 1963, which provided community-based care as an alternative to institutionalization. Paired with the popularization of psychotropics, this law was a watershed in mental health care, plummeting the number of psychiatric beds in the United States from over 500,000 in 1955 to only about 40,000 in 2010. Many state wards were shut down permanently, and the scarcity of treatment caused by the CMHA is directly responsible for a huge upshot in homelessness and imprisonment of individuals with serious mental illnesses. Today, prisons are the new psychiatric wards, with mentally ill individuals accounting for 25% of all inmates. This is all just the tip of the iceberg. It is without doubt that in the decades to come, we will look back on this era of mental health care and cringe at ourselves the same way we do when we remember that the inventor of the lobotomy was laureled with the Nobel Prize in Medicine. From Miltown to Valium to Prozac to Xanax to Adderall, wonder drugs have not just become America's go-to for mental health treatment, they've become an established part of Western life, a part of our brave new world. From the courtrooms to the recording studios, these medications are a muse, a giant, and a god of the postmodern dystopia. Today, I will be performing a sort of root cause analysis on America's mental health epidemic, discussing two critical interlocking factors that need major reforms. I will begin by analyzing bad mental health policies in both the US and Florida, and then I will tackle social and political effects bad policy has on the pharmaceutical industry. The mental illness epidemic imposes a great threat to Western life, and without these needed reforms, the United States is looking towards irreversible problems to its citizens due to the exponential growth of mental illness within our country. I will first discuss how outdated, negligent mental health policy is exacerbating the epidemic and affecting people across our state and country. To give you an idea of just how bad mental health care really is and how easily it can affect anyone in this room, I'm going to start with local issues. Our home state of Florida is ranked 5th worst state for mental health care, with 63.5% of Floridians with mental illness being unable to receive any treatment in the past year. There are two aspects of Florida mental health care that are barriers to progress, and in some ways they are related. The first is the incredible shortage of psychiatrists in the United States, but specifically in Florida. I had the privilege to speak with Dr. Rashesh Shalakia, child, adolescent, and adult psychiatrist at Orange Psychiatrics in Altamont Springs. When telling me about the scarcity of psychiatrists in Florida, I began to realize that this issue is so much worse than I thought. Every single county in our state but one is labeled as having a severe shortage of psychiatrists, with roughly 40% of those counties not even having one psychiatrist at all. Furthermore, Dr. Delakia told me that only about 300 people a year even become psychiatrists nationally, and it also takes an extra 2 years of schooling to become a child psychiatrist. So out of those 300 people who become psychiatrists annually, even fewer become child psychiatrists, which is without a doubt more needed. Because of the vast shortage of child psychiatrists, pediatricians take on most of the mental health evaluations for children, spending on average only about 6 minutes with them. Imagine spending only 6 minutes in the psychiatrist's office. It is unfair to the pediatricians who have to bear that burden without sufficient time or schooling, and it is also unfair to the child and their parents, whose concerns and problems are abbreviated and often misunderstood. Though our pediatricians have the best intentions in mind, not having enough child psychiatrists for proper evaluations is extremely dangerous. This is why Dr. Delakia is dedicated to fighting for the government to promote incentives and perhaps loan forgiveness for future psychiatrists to become child psychiatrists. The second big issue with Florida's mental health care system is the Baker Act. This law is so infamous that it has been verbalized, with the colloquial term "getting Baker Acted" spreading among not just youth in Florida, but throughout the country. Though the Baker Act is not inherently bad, some of the problems with the law are a result of lack of psychiatrists and other forms of mental health care. The Baker Act was created in 1971, named after Florida House of Representative member Maxine Baker, which created a system surrounding involuntary hospitalization. Essentially, if you're found to be a threat to yourself or others, you will be involuntarily committed to a hospital for an up to 72-hour observation period. Every state has a law like this, but today, Florida has the highest number of involuntary hospitalizations out of all 50 states. Over 37,000 children are Baker Acted every year, comprising 18% of all Baker Acts. This is because the once well-intentioned Baker Act has become corrupt, over-administered, and enacted illegally. There are 3 groups that have the authority to initiate a Baker Act: law enforcement officers, mental health professionals, and a court. I'll be focusing on the first 2. Law enforcement officers have the authority to initiate a Baker Act based off of secondhand information that the patient is suicidal. In other words, the officer does not need the patient to directly tell them that they are experiencing symptoms that warrant a Baker Act. A school, parent, or spouse can give them the information, right or wrong, and the officer can Baker Act that individual. This seems reasonable, but when comparing the jurisdiction of an officer to the jurisdiction of a licensed mental health expert, the Baker Act seems completely irrational. Licensed mental health experts, including therapists, psychiatrists, school counselors, can only initiate a Baker Act off of first-hand knowledge that the patient is a threat to themselves or others. In other words, the patient has to deliberately tell them that they are experiencing symptoms that warrant a Baker Act. This unequal authority has led to misuse of Florida's involuntary hospitalization law. Children as young as 5 and 6 are handcuffed and forcibly taken to psychiatric hospitals by police, and minors are often Baker Acted for reasons that have nothing to do with suicidality. Children are instead Baker Acted for developmentally appropriate behaviors like sadness, manifesting traits of neurodevelopmental conditions like autism, and for misbehaving or acting in difficult or defiant ways at school. For reference, 66% of adolescents and adults meet the criteria for PTSD from their experience of being involuntarily committed to a hospital. This is even more traumatizing on a child's malleable mind. The Baker Act was intended to be a crisis mechanism, a last resort. So the fact that involuntary hospitalization is used as a catch-all punishment for children who are not acting normally is cruel, unusual, and negligent, and does not address the root cause of these children's problems. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. All types of mental health care, both inpatient and outpatient, are incredibly scarce and therefore very expensive. Dr. Delakia gave me a great visual about the scarcity of mental health care, not just in our state, but in our country. Firstly, he drew a large circle representing the mentally ill population in the United States. Secondly, he drew a very small circle inside representing those who seek treatment. And lastly, he drew an even smaller circle inside representing those who are treated well. Dr. Dall'Acchia asserted that the shortage, the price, and social stigma of mental health treatment creates a deterrent and barricade between people suffering from mental illness and the treatment they need, especially to marginalized and disadvantaged socioeconomic demographics. This is where my second point about the pharmaceutical industry comes into play. Since mental health treatment has become ineffective, inaccessible, and potentially corrupt, the pharmaceutical industry has stepped in to fill that void. Psychiatric medication is now the go-to way to treat mental illness in America. Though the sole purpose of these drugs is to improve quality of life, the US pharmaceutical industry has managed to turn medicine into a profit center, even if it is not always in the best interest or safety of the consumer. Today, market-driven diagnostic fads sway diagnosis and prescription. Left on a loose leash, the pharmaceutical industry relies on profit-driven motivations, fallacious marketing strategies, and deceptive case studies to sell their latest products. This issue starts with the most basic premise in all of modern psychopharmacology. When people experience any mental disorder, whether bipolar, depression, or gender dysphoria, it is due to some chemical imbalance or deficiency in the brain, which is correctable with certain medications. This is derived from the serotonin hypothesis, a 1950s idea developed by George Ashcroft and Donald Eccleston, who asserted that neurotransmitter system deficits cause depression. Though it was discredited by most neuroscientists and even abandoned by its own creators, the pharmaceutical industry revived the serotonin theory in the 80s for marketing reasons, despite no evidence supporting the theory as factual. Little is actually known about how psychiatric medications actually work on the brain, and yet these drugs are so accessible to us Americans that they have become commonplace. We've all seen those sensational antidepressant commercials on television or the internet, but direct marketing of prescription medication to the public is actually illegal in most countries. Though these commercials are pretty notorious for being melodramatic and misleading, the pharmaceutical industry also implements bad marketing strategies that are not so overt, namely evergreening, in which companies market a drug to one disorder and then move on to explore other green pastures for potential markets. For example, SSRIs, a common type of antidepressant, were initially prescribed to patients just suffering from depression, but their usage has been extended to treat over 6 other conditions from various disorder clusters. These pharmaceutical companies also own their own studies, meaning that they often use placebo effects and biased data to enhance the medication's effectiveness for marketing reasons and discard trials that do not paint their product in a good light. Though SSRIs do have their success stories, studies conducted outside Big Pharma show their overall effectiveness to be next to nothing, with placebo trials replicating 80% of their results. These companies have managed to sell depression, marketing people's emotional problems as indicative of a chemical imbalance or deficiency that only a pharmaceutical drug can fix. And they have pulled off a feat. The pharmaceutical industry is booming now more than ever, but it could be at the risk of millions of US citizens being misprescribed, overprescribed, and experiencing medication dependency and withdrawals. People are diagnosed and medicated at never seen before rates. In 20 years, ADHD diagnosis has tripled, bipolar diagnosis has doubled, and autism diagnosis has increased 20-fold. It is likely true that 30 years ago, many people with mental illness struggled undiagnosed, and science and technology have just uncovered how large these populations are and are snowballing. However, all this new research has, with no doubt, made mental illness marketable, commercialized, and a moneymaker, leading to a degree of overdiagnosis and overmedicating of what is sometimes normal human experience. Some may agree that we do need more mental health care, but believe that more funding should go towards our current treatments, believing that they are sound, scientific, and advancing. Whether or not psychiatry is run right is a highly controversial topic amongst medical professionals and patients alike. A perfect example of this debate is within the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, or the DSM-5. Currently, psychiatrist-based diagnosis on the categorization of disorders outlined by this manual, which provides a common language for clinicians to communicate about their patients and establishes consistent and reliable diagnoses that can be used in research on mental disorders. The DSM is a widely praised touchstone in science, and even its critics concede that despite all its epistemological, scientific, and even clinical failings, the DSM incorporates a great deal of practical knowledge in a convenient and useful format. It does its job reasonably well when it is applied properly and when its limitations are understood. Though the DSM-5 offers a wonderful beginning for diagnosing mental disorders, its intended and most ethical purpose is to serve as a guidebook. However, the DSM-5 has often become the totality of psychiatric diagnosis, defying the true purpose of the manual. The manual's measurements have been considered by some as scientifically arbitrary, culturally biased, and have often defied clinical common sense. Even the introduction of the DSM-5 manual itself prefaces that although some mental disorders may have well-defined boundaries around symptom clusters, scientific evidence now places many, if not most, disorders on a spectrum with closely related disorders that have shared symptoms, shared genetic and environmental risk factors, and possibly shared neural substrates. In short, we have come to recognize that the boundaries between disorders are more porous than originally perceived. The DSM-5 is the most obvious example of how no science is as subjective and theoretical as psychiatry. In fact, psychiatry is really the only medical area where the part of the body experiencing illness is not directly observed. No one knows fully how these categorized mental illnesses work, and no one knows how the medications we use to treat these mental illnesses work even more so. We are strangers to our own theories and strangers to their cures. Despite all the fourth industrial revolution advances in science, technology, and medicine, psychiatry lags behind, being performed in an archaic, pseudoscientific, and trial and error way, despite being arguably the most important aspect of mental health for today's generation. It is clear that if we want to see progress towards a mentally healthier nation, more funding cannot go towards our current outdated methods of treatment. Instead, more research and funding must go towards updated forms of care for mental illness. The key to fixing modern psychiatry is to make it as objective as cardiology or orthodontics. So far, there have been aims by the National Institute of Mental Health to develop, for research purposes, new ways of classifying mental disorders through the Research Domain Criteria Project. This project strives to reorient its way away from the DSM-5, exploring ways of incorporating such methods as genetics, neuroimaging, and cognitive science into future diagnostic schemes based upon behavioral dimensions and neural systems. There's also much debate over if we pay more tax dollars towards mental health care, whether that money should go towards the development and understanding of psychiatric medications, more affordable inpatient or outpatient treatment programs, or into research of new solutions for mental illness. Since we do not know much about how the way psychotropics work, research towards understanding these medications that are being prescribed is very important to their development and better application in the future. Though psychiatric medications have hurt many people, they've also been lifelines for people in times of crisis. This cannot be discounted, and medication certainly has its place in mental health care. However, it is far from the only option a person struggling with mental health problems has. With the scarcity of good mental health treatment, the most available options today are two extremes: medicate from home or go to a hospital. More research towards other remedies, as well as more money into mental health programs, will balance out these extremes and address the root cause of the epidemic. This is essential to our nation's progress towards healing. Cutting-edge research and alternative practice in psychiatry are in their infancy, but show so much promise, especially if they can reach mainstream medicine. Most notably is Dr. Daniel Amen, who uses brain imaging to accurately identify underlying brain issues that can contribute to symptoms and prescribes supplements or medications accordingly. New research in genetics and polymorphisms, vitamin deficiencies, and using supplements instead of medications have also come to show that the root causes of mental illness might extend way beyond just the neurotransmitter deficiencies that psychotropic medications intend to correct. Every person who steps foot in the psychiatrist's office is infinitely complex and infinitely different than the person who just walked out the door. Even people diagnosed with the same disorder will differ drastically in superficial traits like background, worldview, identity, and lifestyle, to incredibly complicated factors like brain chemistry, predispositions, and genetic makeup. But most importantly, each patient is made imago Dei, or in the image of God, with their own set of gifts, trials, blessings, and burdens that the Creator has uniquely tasked them with. 1 year ago, I stopped taking all the medications. I started on a personalized vitamin regimen, started exercising more, cut out destructive habits, and redevoted my life to Christ. Because of God's incredible grace, I have not experienced a major symptom of mental illness since then. My journey is a tiny example of what our culture needs to heal this epidemic, a paradigm shift. We need to change our minds about our own minds. In a brave new world with no God to pray to, we have made the chief source of truth our own emotions. We have made psychiatric medication our idol because we have decided it is the next best thing to a God to alleviate the emotional burden of being alive. But Prozac cannot solve the human condition, and we all know that. But the way America has handled the mental health epidemic makes it so glaringly obvious that our country is crying out for deliverance. But the answers are not in the therapy session, or in the amber pill bottle, or in the diagnosis. This is a striving after the wind. The disease we all have is sin, for which there is no cure other than Christ, who knew us all before the world was invented and was willing to die for our disease. Thank you.
Thank you, Gracie. Those really important issues that you covered with clarity and passion. We want to continue to learn about those issues, so we have a chance to do that now by asking Gracie questions. We can ask her about her argument, clarifying points, or re-explaining points, or amplifying points. A couple of pointers to make sure that this time goes well and we get the most out of it. If you have a question, raise your hand, and Gracie will indicate where I can take the microphone. Hold it close to your mouth, please, so that the recording and the live stream can pick up the question. If you have more than one question, we do have a lot of people in the room, so maybe just ask one and we can come back to you after others have a chance. And try to keep your questions as brief as possible so that Gracie can get to a lot of questions, because I know she knows quite a bit that didn't even make it into her paper. All right, Gracie, where will we begin?
Well done, very well done. You repeated several times that we don't. Sorry, was that? We don't really know how psychotropics work, and is that because we just don't know, or is it because the pharmaceutical companies aren't telling us? And if it's that we just don't know, how do they develop these drugs? Like, where do they come from if they're just like, yeah?
So that's a really good question. Basically, every single kind of pharmaceutical medication, doesn't include psychotropics, is just developed from a certain, basically it was developed because certain, dyes were only dyeing, certain kinds of particles. This was, a really long time ago, 1800s with the development of penicillin and everything. So essentially now, we've developed drugs that pretty much just only regulate, if it's an SSRI, only regulate serotonin, and that's what they tell us, is only regulating the serotonin, but the truth is that we have a very delicate balance in our brain of neurotransmitters, and it affects the whole brain, your whole brain chemistry, the whole way that your brain is working. So we don't know how they really work, because they just mask like the problem. Like if you take an SSRI for depression, it just masks the symptoms, but we don't know how, we don't know what it's doing to your brain. We also don't know what the long-term effects are. But it's not, I don't think it's like the pharmaceutical industry is just not telling us how they work. I don't think it's like some kind of like, hiding what's actually happening sort of thing. I think it's just based on a lot of theories that we honestly don't know about, honestly, and are still trying to like figure out what makes sense.
So, if you have a friend who's dealing with mental illnesses or like depression and stuff, what are some ways that you can be a friend and be there for them?
It depends on the person. I think that's a great thing. Having fellowship, especially as Christians, is a very important part of healing this epidemic that we're in. I'd say just listening. For me, at least, again, depends on the friend. Listening, just being there for them, helping them if you notice some things that are becoming like an issue, or you think that they're gonna be unsafe or whatever. Talking to some trusted adults about that. But honestly, just like listening and hearing what they have to say and letting them know that you care. I think there's nothing better, and pointing them towards God too.
Thank you.
Dr. Vandenberg?
So many questions. I don't know where to start. Great job. You covered a ton of ground. So it sounded like at one point you thought that the best solution was going to be more objective kinds of analysis. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So I worked in a psychiatric hospital right out of college, and I was in the late 80s when there was kind of a bridge between older psychiatrists who didn't medicate very much and younger psychiatrists who all they did was medicate and they didn't do anything else. And so I saw that really sharp ledge there between kind of the two kinds of treatment that were available. And it was interesting to kind of see how each one worked. But if we are looking for something that is so objective in the brain, some kind of physiological thing that we can see, is it not kind of counter to the fact that psychiatric mental health is primarily subjective rather than objective? And so the problem might be not that there's something that you can see that's unsound, but it's the imagination of the person, the ability of the person to perceive reality has changed. And so do you believe that we will find kind of something objective that's going to help us see things, or is it going to be just kind of more murky than that, possibly?
Well, you're absolutely right. Like right now, it's very subjective the way that we both diagnose and treat mental illness. You can go to one doctor and get diagnosed with one, diagnosis from the DSM. And then you could go to another doctor and they could tell you something different. And it happens to a lot of people. And I would really like to think that in the future, we're going to start going towards more objective treatments. Like I said, like everything that we know about psychiatry is based off of theories and patterns and just clusters of things that doctors have noticed over the years and have said, okay, well, this is generalized anxiety disorders characterized by these symptoms. It's not like we are looking at the brain. Maybe more. That's not a great example. Maybe for anxiety, there's been a lot more neuroimaging in that sort of like area. But like ADHD, for example, like there's nowadays there's so many kinds of ADHD. It's this very, very subjective, broad diagnosis. And the truth is like if you have ADHD, you'll probably also have another mental condition, or like bipolar or depression. It's just there's a lot of overlap. So I really hope, and my hope, because I'm going to be optimistic about it, is that there'll be a lot more development on where these mental illnesses come from, because they are very, very, very real. But there'll be more, like we're gonna look at your brain and be like, oh, here's like a section of your brain that, and I'm not like super like well versed in the science behind this, but here's a section of your brain where you're experiencing some kind of, the neural pathway or whatever is showing that, you are more susceptible to depression. Or, look at your DNA sequencing. I know this is a very cutting edge thing that's happening right now. But, polymorphisms, you can be more genetically inclined towards schizophrenia or, whatever. So I hope that we can develop like the more subjective sides of the treatment, because I think with the mind always there's going to be some kind of subjective aspect to every single type of medicine, but we really do need to lean more towards these new ways of treatment. Jen?
Thank you, Gracie, for tackling that issue, which is the love of Christ, and tackling it so eloquently. It's so important. In your argument, you, and I think correctly so, like kind of place this issue within like the context of a very new era that we find ourselves in, right? Very postmodern, brave new world. One of the terms you used, like fourth industrial revolution, was one that I'm not familiar with but was intrigued by. Could you talk a little bit more about this era, maybe the timeline, and different maybe important changes that took place, specifically that term?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of like the industrial revolutions have a very, it's not like super like it started 2000 and now, but essentially, from what I know about the fourth industrial revolution, it wasn't a big part of my research, but the development of cell phones, I don't know if you consider AI now. We're probably entering sort of a very new, probably fifth industrial revolution, but especially development of cellular phones, like the ability, social media ability to communicate much more at a faster rate, internet culture, probably, all those things would probably fit into like the fourth industrial revolution sort of stuff. But does that answer your question?
Yeah,
or is
that's
there
great.
a second? Okay. Done?
I mean, wonderful, John. Your focus on the root cause intrigued me, and we can obviously look to the idea that God's been removed from schools and other things, but you're touching on the genetics and different vitamins and things of that nature. I'm real curious to know what is known about that pathway, and what is what is your perspective on how that particular aspect of this topic will manifest in the future. If you could just spend a little more time talking about that, it would be great.
Do you mean like specifics about like the vitamin route?
Yes,
Like
you know,
for
like
me?
natural, sort of like the natural path is really intriguing to me. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, if I'm going to talk about supplements, I mean, my mom's a certified nutritionist. She's getting her doctorate right now. So a big part for me has been realizing and doing blood labs and stuff and realizing that actually a source of my problem actually derives from deficiencies, like B12 deficiency, B6 deficiency, iron deficiency, folate. All these things can actually like really manifest itself in your mental health, and it can lead to depression, anxiety, whatever. So a lot of times when you take a SSRI, you're just masking the symptom. You're not actually fixing the problem. The problem is that you're like anemic and you need help. And it's like gonna show up in other ways too. So you're just being like, oh, I'm not sad anymore, but I'm still anemic. But a lot of people don't think to do that. So it's really like root, if you're talking about root cause, like there are so many different ways that that depression or anxiety or whatever can actually be because of some sort of like not just a neurotransmitter deficiency. It can be something that's actually a lot more fixable. So one of the things is like polymorphisms too. Like a lot of people know about the MTHFR SNP. Like it's a variation in your DNA sequencing that a lot of people actually have, and that it like inhibits your vitamin B12 and folate metabolism, and that can just lead to depression. And it's just because you're just genetically predisposed to not producing a lot of vitamin B12, which you can supplement with, and I have, and I can testify that like my energy levels like are back to like normal because I realized that was a big part of it, was having just vitamin deficiencies. So.
Thank you.
Salem?
You did a really fantastic job. My question, so you talked a lot about how psychiatry isn't really a prominent major or something that people aren't as interested in, and I know that psychology is, like, people talk a lot about how psychology is something that people are really interested in. Can you kind of explain what's the difference and how like the education is different in those two areas?
Oh yeah, so that's something that a lot of people get mixed up sometimes. And even before I did this thesis, I didn't really know the difference either. Psychology is basically like you can go be a mental health expert or a licensed therapist with that thing. There's a lot of things you can do with a psychology degree, but those are kind of like, psychology is focusing more on like therapy, and it's not a doctorate degree. Psychiatry is a doctorate degree where you can diagnose and prescribe medications, and it takes a lot of, that's like med school. It's like you're a doctor, but psychology is like you can't diagnose and you can't prescribe, but it's more like you're becoming a therapist, and they work together. A lot of the times, psychologists and psychiatrists work very hand in hand, and there is a lot of overlap, and they both know a lot about the other. So. Matthew?
We have time for one or two more questions.
Thank you, incredible job. You talked a little bit about how there's this kind of self-accountability that comes on us now with working out, taking accountability for our health, and just seeking, the Lord in our personal relationships to help improve our mental state. How do you think that just necessary cultural change of this like new generation can fight against and counteract this like precedent of current psychiatrists like slapping labels and medication onto kids when it kind of seems like there's this necessary change that almost falls into our own hands?
That's a really good question. Honestly, I think like as like the Christian like new generation, as we like rise up, I think it's very important that we sort of establish mental health through these more like holistic means. You know, and even like things like social media, actually social media could really help with that sort of issue. I haven't really given this a lot of thought, but it's obviously a very personal sort of choice to help your mental health through like more holistic means rather than, you know, choosing to go the more medication route or whatever. But I think it's just something like that as Christians and as this new generation, we're just gonna have to collectively sort of decide to do. And it is a big cultural thing, and it's definitely something that's, honestly, with like all the mental health issues that are arising today, it's almost gonna be a sort of backlash, like where our generation, especially kids younger than us, are probably gonna decide to sort of go the alternate route, and I think that if that does happen, I think that would be a really, really great thing. I don't know if it makes any sense. Lily?
Lily will have the closing question.
Incredible job, Gracie. So proud of you. So I'm wondering how we can reduce social stigma and what our individual responsibility is for that, or how that can be fixed kind of going into the future.
That's a great question. And there is so much social stigma, and that was something in my thesis that I was gonna write a whole another section about social stigma, because it's something that is a huge component and goes very hand in hand with the way that policymakers decide what kind of laws to enact, and also the pharmaceutical industry is the way that people think about it individually and collectively. It's like, you know, every social issue just starts with people if there's a problem there. I have some notes about like stigma. Like for what I think we should do. Honestly, I'm gonna like go off on a little tangent here. So there's two types of stigma that like I see, and like I'm gonna like explain what ways that we can counteract it, especially as young Christians going into the world, and we're gonna have a big impact on the culture, obviously. So like the first one is like mental illness isn't real, like it's a sign of weakness sort of thing, and you know that comes from like transgenerational cultural places, and obviously like that's like what we think of when we think of stigma, but really like that's not the kind of stigma that we are gonna have to counteract as we go into our adulthood. It's more like this new thing on the internet, and I was gonna put this in my thesis, but it's not really something I can point to like with evidence. It's something that you just have to kind of know, and I know like you guys are gonna know what I'm talking about. It's just like this like microculture of like overcorrection of like mental illness stigma, and it's like you know like, oh, you had a trauma, girl, he gaslighted you, take a mental health day kind of thing, and like those can be good things, those can be really good things, and I'm glad that we're actually overcorrecting the issue, but like it needs to be like kind of reeled in a little bit. But it's because, and the reason why we have that, I really put a lot of thought into this. The reason, like just from what I observed, we have this is because we don't have good enough mental health care, and it's not it's not accessible enough to anyone. So people go on the internet and, you know, they read like one Mayo Clinic article and they decide that they have a mental disorder. And it's really dangerous. And the internet is like, you know, like really promotes like all these buzzwords and psychology terms, like becoming slang, you know, like delusional or like gaslighting. Those are psychology terms, and you know, it's a different kind of stigma because it's like an aesthetic. So if you have schizophrenia or borderline personality disorder, that's not cool. That's that's, you know, that's like pushed aside. It's like, oh, if you know you have depression or if you're very high functioning, that's the sort of thing that's destigmatized. But it doesn't help everyone. It's actually very unhelpful because there's this huge gap. So to answer your question, kind of went off a little bit because this is something I really care about. But as Christians, like how I answered in my last question, just promoting healthy lifestyles and not glamorizing or like ignoring mental illness, and finding this happy medium together where we promote fellowship and, you know, listening to one another and empathy. I know, you know, you had a lot of your thesis was about empathy. I think that is just so critical. And Christianity, I mean, obviously Christianity is going to solve, and like the promotion of Christ in our culture would promote so much more mental well-being, and I know that firsthand. But I think, yeah, just using our voices and listening to one another is really important. So.
I hope you'll keep the conversation going, Gracie. Congratulations.